Hello again, Michelle. As always, you had some really good questions after this last video, so I want to talk about those first, hopefully answer all of them. There's a couple that we might be talking about, different ideas, so I'll try to clarify as best I can, but you might need to ask another question to follow that up if I don't answer what you were talking about. But first question that you had, what do the colors in the charts that I've been putting up mean? Nothing. They may mean a little bit depending on your context, but there's been a lot of different attempts to connect different colors with different notes. The problem is that there's no agreed upon standard for that. So I've seen some systems where the root note is red. I've seen other systems where the root note is blue. I've seen systems that go by intervals of fifth to change the colors. I've also seen systems where they just go one note at a time, chromatically through all the notes, just phasing through the spectrum. So there's not an agreed upon way to look at the colors and know what it means. You'd have to actually look into what kind of system that person is using. For the charts that I'm giving you, I'm getting these from a website, and I have the link in the description here. And as far as I can tell, they're using the colors to identify the octaves. So, for instance, all the root notes are red. So if we're doing the E Mixolydian mode, then all the E's will show up as red. Makes it a little bit easier for you to find what the root is, find a good starting point, ending point. You can also see that certain colors are always the same number in the scale, but again, it's probably not worth your time trying to figure out what all those colors are. Just use that as a way to easier navigate through the fretboard. So probably just looking at the root as the red notes would be the best way I would suggest to approach that. It just makes it a little bit easier to tell where you are in relation to your roots. You might use that later to see like what color is the fifth note, and then you can reference all the fifth notes. But I think for the most part, the colors are just there to be a little bit more organized. Second question, can we mix modes? Let me see exactly what you said. I think you said, can we mix the Mixolydian and the Lydian mode? Which is a really interesting question because we have to be a little more specific about that. How would you want to mix them? Do you want to just take all those letters in both modes, put them in a big frying pan, and then just pull them all out? Or do you want to select some to keep and some to leave? Because there's very different results. If you try to keep all of them, then you end up with a scale or a mode that's much longer than your normal scale. We're used to having 7 unique notes in our scale or our mode, and if we kept all of them, think about the two differences. We have the Lydian has, let's refer to A major here for this. So Lydian would have the 4th degree sharped. So A, B, C sharp, D sharp. So that would be a new note to add in. So along with the normal D that's in the Mixolydian, we'd also have the D sharp. And if you wanted to then look at the 7th note between the Mixolydian and the Lydian, you have G and G sharp. So if you just put all those together, you get A, B, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F sharp, G, G sharp. So it's a lot more notes. Interestingly, if you just go down that route, there is some very, very, very close things. We can talk about that a little bit more later, but if you want to bring it up, we can talk about the bebop scales. We're really, really close to a bebop scale with what you have right there. If we didn't want to keep all the notes, another option would be to keep select notes. So if we look at the Lydian scale, Lydian mode, we know that the fourth degree is different than the major scale. So if we just look at the differences and maybe just keep those things that are less familiar to us than the major scale, so keep that sharpened fourth, so A, B, C sharp, D sharp, but then keep the flatted seventh from the Mixolydian. So keep going up from D sharp, E, F sharp, G, A, B, C sharp, D sharp, E, F sharp, G. That's a little bit more interesting, and actually that has its own name, and that comes about as I don't know what to say here without getting too deep into something, but that comes as a mode from a different scale, from the melodic minor scale. And right now, we're looking at the modes that come from the major scale. So I think I want to leave that right there for now. Trying to dip into two different pools here might be a little more information than I think would be easily digested right now. So for now, know that is a thing that is used, but it comes more naturally from a different place, from the standpoint of the melodic minor. So let's leave that one alone. If you want to use that, mess around with that, that's totally fine. If you want to spend some time on the drone session here trying that out, then go for it. There's plenty of experiment space here with this video series, so feel free to take advantage of that. There is another way that modes could be mixed. I'm not sure if it's the same way that you're referring to, but we have the possibility to just borrow stuff from other modes. This is actually very, very common. Couple songs, I was looking through a bunch of songs trying to see some that would probably be familiar to you. One that stood out to me that you should know is Let It Go from Frozen. If you listen to it, and especially in the verse, you'll notice that the endings of those phrases, they're almost the same. The first phrase ending is on a B flat minor chord, which fits naturally into the F minor that they're playing in there. And then the second phrase ending goes to a B flat major chord, which is not natural to what they're using right there. And as we'll see today, that actually could be borrowed from the F Dorian mode. So there's one place where just that one chord shows up. And I think stylistically, the reason they use that is the whole verse is about her kind of going back and forth with her conflicted thoughts about staying true to family and following her own desires. So that fits really well. This chord that is on one side fits in, and then the next time it doesn't fit in. The chord itself is sort of in conflict as to what it wants to be. And even further, when you get into the chorus, there's an entire key change, and that chord is the chord that transitions from the first key to the second key. So I think it's a really nice example of how to use modes to not only make the music more interesting, but actually maybe tell a little bit of story with the chords themselves. Some other songs that I thought of that you could look at were Green Day's Boulevard of Broken Dreams. If you listen to that, there's a couple places where there's a chord that just doesn't really seem to fit either of the two modes that get used. It goes from one mode in the verse to another mode in the chorus, but neither of those modes match the last chord of the chorus. So that could also be another example of borrowing, or perhaps you want to use the term mixing in another mode, just very, very briefly. We could also talk about the idea of switching from one mode to another for perhaps the whole verse or the whole chorus, but I don't think that really is the best term there, because we're not having elements of both modes kind of simultaneously. We are more transitioning, using one for a while and then saying, okay, we're done with that. Now let's move to this one, and now let's use this one for a while and then come back. But the idea of mixture to me is more along the lines of a very temporary, this thing doesn't belong in this mode, this is getting used right here, and then we go right back into the mode we were just in. So not really an easy way to analyze it, perhaps would be a better way of thinking about it. If we're in one mode for a whole verse, it's really easy to say, okay, this chord and this chord and this chord and this chord, they all fit into this mode, so we're very clearly in this mode. Having one chord that stands out is a little bit more of a sudden mixture, I would call that. Next two questions are the really, really interesting ones. You said, how do we know what home is best for a chord / scale? And I would say to that might not be the correct question, because we wouldn't be... I guess what you're trying to ask is, what is the most natural home for a scale or a chord? And I would probably argue, and I've seen others argue this as well, that the major scale, if we're using any of those modes, the actual major scale is the most at home because of how much in common we have with the overtone series when we play that root note on the C major scale. We have a lot of agreement in these frequencies, whereas some of these other modes you don't have, especially just considering, say, the minor mode, don't have as many overtones overlapping. And maybe a different example we could say is, if you can imagine two people singing, holding a sustained note, they will sound the most together, the most unified when they sing the exact same pitch. Not even different octaves, but the exact same pitch. And that's the idea of their pitches are overlapping more when they're singing the exact same pitch. Even though if I sing and you sing, because we have different bodies, we will have different frequencies that are coming out of us besides that one that's the loudest. But overall, we will still have the majority of our frequencies will be overlapping, and that will make it sound more together, which we usually consider to be a very pleasant sound and a very stable sound too. A lot of the notes that sound like they're in tension with each other are notes that do not share many frequencies on the overtones, and that's part of why we consider those sounding very tense, very unresolved. So the ones that are more stable would probably be a good way to think about your question there. But going back to the idea, I think that's the wrong question in the first place, because when we're thinking about chords or scales, the home is based on the context that you want to use this in. If you want to make a piece that sounds very, very pleasant, very easy to listen to, maybe it's a very happy piece, there's not a lot of conflict in what you're talking about, you want this song to cheer people up, to make them feel good, then you're going to go towards modes that will be best for that. Maybe not even modes. Maybe you're going to write your song in a way that fits that context. And that may or may not be what we considered the most natural home for that mode. If you want your song to be very unresolved, very haunting, or unsettling, then you may choose a home that doesn't feel like the natural fit for that scale. So the context, I think, is more important here than trying to figure out what the best home is for any mode or scale. One last thought on that idea about home. Maybe a better way to think about this question is to turn it around and say, what home would suit this idea that I'm going for best, instead of maybe the other way around. And your last question was about pedal notes. And let me double check the question again. Can we play pedal notes of a chord scale on a different drone? So this is the one that I will try to rephrase it the way that I think you are saying it. And if that's not what you were trying to say, then you can correct me and ask it again. So what I think you're trying to say is that can we have another sustaining note, very much like a drone, over another drone? Can we have two drones simultaneously? If that's not what you're asking, then please correct me next time. But the answer is yes. You can have an entire chord acting as a sustained undernote or overnote. It's very common to see this in songs, actually. On guitar, it's very, very easy to just lock in one finger on the top string or maybe even on the bottom string and play chords that change, but that one note stays the same the whole way through. You can also achieve this effect even without sustaining the note indefinitely by repeatedly playing the note. And I'll link a piece that you can listen to if you haven't listened to it before, a piece by Chopin, often titled the Raindrop Prelude, where he does this the whole way through. There's just this repeating note being played. At first, it's underneath the melody. Then later on, it's above the melody. And then you can also listen that repeated note, that sort of drone or pedal note, that is actually changed at a few places to a different note. So maybe that's actually what you were asking about. Can we change the drone in mid-song? If that's your question, yes, that can happen too. And that is also something very common to happen. But if you're asking about can we have multiple notes in the drone itself, I would suggest looking at the video that I'll put in the description and watch. There's especially one spot where the camera shows his right hand very clearly, and you can see that he's playing. I think at that point he's just playing octaves, but there's more than one note there, and there's a few places that it changes, even just from chord to chord. The idea of a drone doesn't have to be one note the entire way through a song, although using an actual drone is very, very common to do that if you're going for that kind of style of music. And I think that was your last question. Yes. Okay, so let's talk about one more mode for today, and I'll try to make this a little bit more. We'll open up the idea of mode just a little bit here. I don't want to open the whole floodgates here and bring in too much, but I'm going to bring in one idea, just tease it right now, let you think about it, see if you can come to any conclusions about that. But we're going to move into the Dorian mode, okay? We have seen two modes aside from the major scale that have only one difference from the major scale. we saw the mixolydian with the flatted seventh, and we saw the Lydian with the raised or sharpened fourth. So now we're going to talk about the Dorian, and let me just put up here the A major scale for reference here again. A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp, back to A. And now let's see the Dorian mode for A. A, B, C, D, E, F sharp, G, back to A. So you can see that there are two differences here from our major scale. We have the third flattened, and we have the seventh flattened. And this is actually very, very similar to the minor scale, which we'll talk about in a later episode. So sometimes people will talk about it as how it's different from the minor scale. There's only one difference from the minor scale, and that's the F sharp. In the minor scale, it would be F natural. So you can talk about this in terms of how different it is from the major scale or how different it is from the minor scale. But I want to propose another way to think about, to consider these modes and how we reference them in our brain, how we think about them as we're playing. So take a look at these notes and just imagine that we don't have any starting point on these. We just have like alphabet soup here. They're just swirling around, no rhyme or reason to which one is the first. And see if you recognize this set of notes from anywhere else. I'm not going to go any further into that for now. I want you just to start thinking about that and see if you can make any connections from that. So once again, the idea of the Dorian being used in the middle of songs like Let It Go. Let's quickly look at the F major scale, then the F Dorian, so we can talk about that one chord that shows up that's a temporary usage of the Dorian. So our F major scale would be F, G, A, B flat, C, D, E, F. Okay. Now, if we go to the Dorian, we would take the third and make that one note flatter. So F, G, A flat. And then we would also take the seventh, the E, and make that flat as well. So that would be F, G, A flat, B flat, C, D, E flat, back to F. And then if we compare that to the F minor scale, because the beginning of the song it seems like it's in F minor. The rest of the whole verse fits very well in F minor. And the difference between the F minor and the F Dorian is that the D would be D flat in F minor. So when they're playing through the verse and they get to the B flat minor, that makes sense because here's the notes in B flat minor. We have that D flat. That makes sense in F minor. But when we get to the B flat major, that D flat is not part of F minor. So one way you could explain what they're doing here is they're temporarily using a chord from F Dorian. There's other ways you could think about where that's coming from, but that's one reasonable explanation or way to think about it. And last thing that I will say before we switch over to bringing in the drone and experimenting around with this is, since you asked about mixing the modes, I'd like to encourage you to try doing that today while you practice. I will do an example of playing for a little while in one mode, switching to a different mode, and then switching to another one. And I'll bring up, whenever those are changing, I'll bring up whichever mode is currently being used, but I'll try to show you the mixolydian, the Lydian, in the Dorian unless I just forget in the moment. But I'll put whatever I'm using up on the screen so you can tell when the shift is happening. I'm just going to be using the A drone underneath. So I'll be using A Lydian, A Mixolydian, and A Dorian. But there's no reason that you can't just completely change from, say A Lydian to E Mixolydian, or, whichever mode, whichever drone you want. For now, I'm going to leave the drone note the same throughout, just that makes it a little bit easier, but I would like to get to a point where we are experimenting by changing the drone underneath as we go through and give you a little bit more opportunity to choose where you're going, like which mode you're using at that time. But that's enough for now. That's probably too much for one video, but let's switch over and let's hear what the A Dorian sounds like, and then I'll use a little bit of A Dorian and then switch between some of the modes for a little bit so you can hear how it sounds to go from one to the other in the middle of a piece.